One, that if the book was simply a shallow fraud by a 19th century frontier con artist, a kind of country yokel, didn't know much and so on, I would think the book would have collapsed a long time ago. Now, I'm not saying there are no arguments against it.
We'll talk about those in part two, but yeah.
But there are even some where I think, okay, that's a serious argument, and we may or may not yet have a really good answer to it. But to my mind, the whole thing should be an obvious fraud. I mean, the fact that it's lasted and that people with superb training in ancient studies and so on still believe it to be true and believe it to be credible, I just don't think that ought to be happening. If it's really old Joe Smith, the frontier seer, con artist who made it up, as Fawn Brody said, to sort of play a prank on his parents.
Yeah, frauds are always...
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm really excited for today's episode. I'm going to be interviewing someone who is very famous in the apologetic circle, the man, the myth, the legend, Dan Peterson. Dan, thanks for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's an honor. So I've been doing a series on my channel, like exploring the Book of Mormon, looking at the historicity, the truth claims, looking at things that critics bring up, anachronisms, DNA, King James Bible, type versus loose translation, historicity, and I've been interviewing and talking to different scholars. Like I've spoken to Brant Gardner, Blake Ostler, who you would know, Stephen Smoot, Brian Hales, and asking questions about the composition, historicity of the Book of Mormon, responding to issues critics would bring up. And I thought you would be a great person to bring on. I've listened to some of your Fair Mormon conferences and articles, and you've done a lot of work on the Book of Mormon, evidence for the Book of Mormon, and the witnesses of the gold plates. And maybe include some links where people can go and watch some of those. But I think this will be a fun and interesting discussion. But for any of my listeners who may not know who you are, would you want to tell us a little bit about your background, your work in scholarship, apologetics? You were a BYU professor, and I have on here you taught Islamic studies and Arabic studies at BYU, and you're also involved and you have a PhD in Near Eastern languages and culture from UCLA. That's
right.
Correct. And then you've also been involved a lot in apologetics, like FAIR and the Interpeter Foundation. So tell us just a wee bit about your sort of scholarly and apologetic background.
Right. Well, my bread and butter was, as you mentioned, Islamic studies and Arabic, specifically, I guess, the history of Islam, not so much the political history, although I have taught that, but the history of Islam as a religion, the basic doctrines of Islam. I taught courses on Islamic culture and civilization and Islam as religion, on the Quran, many times in both English and Arabic. And so I suppose my specialties have been Islamic philosophical theology and Quranic studies, and simply generally Islamic studies. And so that's what I did day in, day out as a professor at BYU. I retired in July 1st of 2021. It was easier to do because of COVID.
Right.
I found that the part I enjoyed the most was the interaction with students, and when it was simply staring into a computer screen, it wasn't the same.
No, definitely not.
I liked the back and forth, the repartee, and so on, and it just wasn't happening in quite the same way. It was easy. I could wake up in the morning, tumble out of bed, flip on the computer, and teach a class. But after a while, it was constraining, and so it was easier to leave. And at one point, I remember teaching a small Quran class, and one of the students in the class, I could tell, was sitting outside by a swimming pool under an umbrella. And I said, "Where are you?" She had a drink on the table and all that sort of thing. And she said, "I'm in Puerto Vallarta, in Mexico, on the Mexican Riviera." And I thought, oh my,
wow. College
life has changed since when I was a student. That you could be in class while sitting on the Mexican Riviera by the beach. But anyway, I quit that. And people have sometimes said to me, "Oh, you have a beard now. It makes you look very professorial." Well, actually, at BYU, it's post-professorial. You can't wear beards at BYU.
Right. Yes.
Unless you have a
That
beard.
was my first reaction whenever I saw you. I was like, "Whoa, you've got a beard."
Yeah.
Always want to grow
I,
one. Was that like the plan as soon as you retired?
I started the day I retired, and I had one until right after I was hired, actually. So I've always wanted to get back to it. Although then it was dark, and I remember being in Moscow once and standing beneath a 7-story tall painting of Vladimir Lenin delivering a speech. And we actually looked remarkably similar. I'm not sure if I liked that or didn't like that, but it was amusing. I struck a pose just like his, and we got a photograph of me there. In those days, it was a dark beard, but no longer. I'm a
No
gray beard.
longer.
Yeah. So,
That's awesome.
yeah. So I don't know if that answers what you wanted. I mean, I got involved with apologetics officially shortly after I came to BYU. John W. Welch, asked me to edit a new journal that he wanted me to start for the Old Farms Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, which we called then the Review of Books on the Book of Mormon. And that kind of morphed into, well, everything else I do.
Yeah.
Since then. I think he may have wondered sometimes if he hadn't created a monster. He just wanted a little book review collection, and I decided, heck, let's make the book review worth reading in and of itself.
Yes.
So we had review essays, and essays that were in a few cases, I would have to say, more important than the book they were responding to.
Right.
So that became quite the thing. Controversial, and we'll probably talk about that at some point.
Yes. Yeah, it can, and I've noticed that since since doing my channel, it can be a very polarizing, polemic place, especially talking about controversial things to do with the church or truth claims, between critics and apologists or believers and non-believers. But
Right.
yeah, we can sure touch on that later.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say about your career, working at BYU? Anything about your work in apologetics before we sort of talk about the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed my time at BYU very, very much. It was a good place to be. I liked my colleagues. And this is kind of rare among at least American academics. At a lot of conferences I would go to, the main free time enterprise was complaining about the schools they taught at. And I used to have to say to myself internally, don't be too smug. You actually like the place you work. I liked my department chair and my dean, got along with them just fine. It wasn't a blood feud all the time. So I did enjoy that. It's a congenial environment. I was in the Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages,
Yes.
where the only thing we had in common really was that we had nothing much in common. I mean, it was Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, and Hebrew, plus an assemblage of other
Ultimately
languages.
different.
Yeah, I called it the Department of Weird Scripts because they were so different and they weren't using the Roman alphabet that we're accustomed to. So,
Right.
but it was a good department, and we got along really, really well. Maybe because our territory didn't really impinge on anybody else's territory.
Yeah. Yeah, all to
So,
yourself. You weren't competing or having to,
right.
go up against each other.
Right. So, so that was a really nice place to be, and it just really enjoyed the time there. Good people.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to have a discussion on the Book of Mormon. Part one, we're going to be focusing on sort of evidence to support the Book of Mormon, a case for the Book of Mormon. And the 4 sort of subtopics that we talk about that could be good to focus on is talking about maybe, the text of the Book of Mormon, complexity in some of maybe the Hebraisms of things that might support it being either, authentic, historical, or maybe beyond Joseph's capability, talking about the geography and archaeology and historicity for the Book of Mormon, the witnesses of the gold plates, which you've done a lot of work on as well, and then the translation process, the composition, both the mechanics and like the time frame in part 1, and just sort of like laying a case for the Book of Mormon, because I think to be fair, balanced, and objective, you shouldn't just be focusing on things going against it, but the things for it. And I think that's important for people who are trying to make a balanced, informed decision. But before we dive into the topics, any opening statement you want to give just on the Book of Mormon generally, as a ancient text, or what it means to you, or your work in apologetics and dealing with critics surrounding the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, I think the sheer existence of the Book of Mormon is somewhat astonishing, and we ought to not take that for granted. It's a pretty amazing thing for a young man of Joseph's background on the frontier of America, very unsophisticated, a kind of country frontier rube, if you will, to produce a book like this. And to have produced it, as far as we can tell, in a period of about 2.5 months working time. That's an astonishingly rapid pace of composition, if you want to assume it to be composition. I know I keep a record of how much I write. I'm not always good at that, but typically I have for the past 15 years or so. I have certain goals of how much I want to write that's publishable, at least ultimately, in any given week or on any given day. And I have never maintained the pace that Joseph Smith would have had to maintain to produce the Book of Mormon in 2.5 months. I've maybe done it for a day or two, but I haven't been able to sustain it. And I have to say, I write rapidly, and I have the advantage of writing on a computer, which is more sophisticated. Yeah, it was more sophisticated than anything on the Apollo mission, in terms of computing power and so on. I'm not using more than a fraction of it, of course, but I have all sorts of advantages. I think, for example, of the first book that I wrote, which is a book on the Middle East, I was asked to write it by a small publishing company that's now defunct, actually, but they wanted me to do a sort of introduction to the Middle East for a Latter-day Saint audience, and I asked them how long I had to write it, and they named a time that was actually not very far away. And that actually sold me on the idea more than discouraging me. So it came at a time when I was going to have a term off. I taught the spring term, but not the summer term at BYU. So I would have about 2 months, 2.5 months, about the time that Joseph Smith had.
You're going to take up the challenge, see if you could do it as well.
I wanted to see if I could do it. And here the advantage was I'd been teaching on these subjects. A lot of what I did in the book was simply the things I lectured on, sort of pouring out of my mind, into these computer files. And I could do it pretty much uninterrupted day in, day out. We didn't have a big vacation. Our kids were small. We weren't going anywhere particularly. And at the end of it, I was really impressed with myself. I finished the book in a little over 2 months. And it occurred to me, I wonder how long it is, and I wonder how long the Book of Mormon is. Well, my book, it turned out, was about 140,000 words. The Book of Mormon is about 100,000 words longer than that. And I was writing rapidly on a subject I knew well, a subject in which I had a PhD, a subject on which I had taught. And I wrote quickly, and still, I wasn't anywhere near the length of the Book of Mormon. And I mean, you could make the argument the Book of Mormon is a more significant book than mine, but the fact was I was impressed by the sheer disparity in numbers.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, okay, Fawn Brodie said, well, Joseph's imagination was like a spring freshet. It just overflowed, like a spring up in the mountains. Well, fine, it's easy to say that, but it's much harder to do it. And I'm wondering if Fawn Brodie herself, writing her book, wrote at that pace. I doubt very much that she did.
And I've often wondered as well, like I've thought about, like, okay, if Joseph is a fraud, if he wrote it himself or dictated himself, why so many pages? Why 588 pages? You think maybe 100 or 200 pages, and that would convince people, that would be enough sort of narrative content to make up, like, why so much? Because surely the longer it is, the more likely that it's going to appear to be a fraud as well.
Yeah. Well, and I even have wondered sometimes, well, why, if you're just making it up, why do the Book of Mormon at all? Why a lengthy narrative book? Just claim to be a prophet and receive revelations in the manner of the Doctrine and Covenants. That would be enough. Tell people you're a prophet. Some would believe you. But the Book of Mormon, it seems to me, is a kind of curious challenge right there at the very beginning of Joseph's ministry. And it's this big thing, which is very difficult to account for, very hard to duplicate, and, as I guess we'll be talking about in a few minutes, extraordinarily complex. And as you say, the longer it goes on, the difficulties don't just multiply. They don't increase arithmetically, I would say. They increase geometrically. If it's twice as long, it's, I would say, roughly 4 times as hard You know, 4 times long, 16 times as hard. There are so many places you can trip up by messing up a reference, flubbing the geography. You've got all these place names and descriptors that you've got to keep straight. You have to have some sort of internal map in your mind, or have it be a real map. I mean, I could talk very consistently about the geography of the Western United States. I'm not going to mess it up because it's real. It exists objectively outside of me. I know that Montana is north of Utah, Arizona is to the south. I'm not likely to mess that up. But if it's an entirely imaginary map, I'm going to forget. Now, what was north of what? And where was this river? And even without thinking about it, I'll put the river somewhere where it simply can't be, or I'll put a town to the west where it should be to the east or something like that. And Joseph does not do that.
Yes.
Which I think is amazing given his lack of sophistication. He's got 2.5 months of formal education in a frontier school. We know because we can read the things he wrote in his own hand that he was not a very good writer. He couldn't spell, couldn't punctuate, that sort of thing. I'm not saying he was stupid. That certainly is not true. But was he educated? Absolutely not. He just wasn't. And to produce a book, how many books published in 1830 are still read today?
What level of education would you say Joe Smith had? I think when I talk with Brian Hales, and I've heard most scholars say maybe like a 3rd grade equivalent education. I'm translate that into my own educational system, but not those. But I know some critics would say that because Joe Smith Sr. he was a teacher as well, and Hiram, and they think that maybe he might have had more education than maybe the grade level.
But you can read what he wrote, and you can tell he didn't write very well. I mean, we have examples in his handwriting of things that he wrote, and the grammar is bad, and the punctuation, the spelling are terrible. Now, I will say that spelling in the United States, I don't know what it was like in the UK or Ireland during that period, but spelling conventions weren't as well established. It took Noah Webster and his dictionary, I think, to basically establish that for American English. So people would spell their own names in different ways, and spell different words according to the way they sounded or the way they felt that day or whatever. So, but even by that standard, Joseph's writing is pretty bad. And it's clear to me that he felt self-conscious about it. He always had scribes that he felt could write better than he could. I think he was self-conscious about it. Now, later on, when they had the Joshua Seixas Hebrew School in Heartland and so on, Joseph was apparently a very good student. He was very bright. He grasped things quickly. His Hebrew, he wasn't quite as good as Orson Pratt, but then I doubt that he had as much time to concentrate as Orson Pratt did. And Orson Pratt was something of a frontier genius anyway, self-taught mathematician and everything else. But he was pretty good. He was near the top of his class in the Hebrew school, which indicates he was not stupid. He was not incapable of learning, but he hadn't had the opportunities. Even his wife, Emma, said that he couldn't dictate a well-worded letter, let alone write a book. And she knew him extremely well. I sometimes am puzzled by modern-day critics who form a view of Joseph's educational level that the people who actually knew him and lived with him would have disputed. Now, who's in a better position to judge how well educated he was by the standards of the day than the people of his day who knew him well?
They all thought he was sort of an unlearned, ignorant farm boy. That a lot of the theories that were going around at the time were that there had to be another manuscript like Solomon Spalding, and then maybe Ethan Smith or Sidney Rigdon. They didn't think that Joseph would have had maybe the capabilities to have done it himself. There had to be another natural explanation.
Yeah, and I think that's because they recognized the problem, where some people today say, well, he just wrote it himself. Well, his contemporaries did not think him capable of that.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. So let's talk a little bit about, the complexity of the text. My understanding of the eyewitnesses of the translation process. Emma said there was no book or manuscript. We can maybe talk about if the King James Bible was involved and your views on that. But it appears from what the witnesses have said, both I think critics and apologists, only those who think in some sort of conspiracy, there is no hidden manuscript he was reading from, no notes he was putting in there. It doesn't appear that he was looking at the manuscript, to see where, he finished off to continue going. And like you said, he dictated within sort of 2.5 months, this 531 page, very complex, intricate narrative about, the history and a religious document about these people in the Americas. So maybe if you touch on what are some things in the text that you point to it having both complexity, but also things which point to it having some ancient origin or authenticity?
Well, complexity is it's a complex topic to touch on. Jack Welch has done some work on legal issues in the Book of Mormon, and what he finds, and it's easier to find now because we have computer search capabilities and so on, is that when certain crimes or certain offenses against the Nephite polity are mentioned, they tend to be mentioned in formulaic language that's repeated throughout the book. Now, it would be one thing if you had a computer and could go back and say, now, how did I describe this 200 pages ago, and find that phrase and then stick it in here again? But he couldn't do that. Evidence indicates he never went back to look at what he had done. So what Jack argues is that there seems to be a Nephite legal code undergirding this, so that there's certain phrases that simply recur because they're part of the legal culture in that particular aspect of the Book of Mormon. So, for example, we have in the U.S., and I'm assuming maybe under British common law and in Ireland, phrases like beyond a reasonable doubt, things like that. You have to establish certain cases. There's certain formulaic languages language or phrasing that you use. And you see the same thing in the Book of Mormon, and it's throughout. Or another case, and I should have looked up the reference, I don't have it right now, but when Lehi says that he had a vision of God seated in thrones, surrounded by numerous concourses of angels who were singing and praising.
Methought I saw God. Yeah.
That same phrase shows up 150 pages later when someone is recalling that vision. Now,
I think exactly the same language. 36, maybe
I think about there. Yep. And I think that's really striking. And there's no evidence that Joseph had ever said, let's go back and see how Lehi described that. And in fact, if you subscribe to the doctrine, or to the understanding that what we have now is probably dictated starting with the first chapter or maybe the second chapter of Mosiah.
They continued after the loss of the 116 pages, continued on, from Mosiah, and then they went back and then translated the small plates.
Then in that case, Alma is quoting from a passage that hasn't been written yet and has to be written in when you go back to write, if you're thinking Joseph's making it up, he's got to go back.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's a lot to keep in your mind if you're dictating at the rate of 8.5 to 11 printed pages a day.
Right. So Alma would have said, methought I saw Lehi. Okay, yep. That's interesting. I've not made that connection before, because yes, that would have been later in the translation or dictation process in First Nephi when Lehi sees it. Right.
So these are just the kinds of things that make it very hard for me to imagine Joseph just making it up on the fly. The book is too complicated, and I've already mentioned the geographical picture. It's a consistent, coherent geographical picture,
yes,
indicating that whoever wrote the Book of Mormon had a map in his mind. Now, it's more plausible to me to believe that it's a real map in Mormon's mind than that it's a hypothetical map, never sketched out, not hanging on the wall where he's dictating, so he could look up and say, "Oh yeah, that's right, Zarahemla is here." It's easier for me to believe that it reflects a real geography as conceived by the authors. But certainly it's an impressive feat to keep the geography straight.
I remember as well reading an article or watching a video about, in First Nephi, when it talks about them going up to Jerusalem, it's always going up to the land of Jerusalem, because uphill, and then it's down as they leave. And I think there's also references to other locations, in the Book of Mormon in the Americas, where it's going up consistently and down somewhere, which is interesting that it's completely consistent.
Yeah, and it fits Jerusalem. I mean, I was just in Jerusalem a couple of weeks ago, and I go there fairly frequently. And, the fact is that from just about any point, Jerusalem is up. You go up to Jerusalem, you go down from Jerusalem to every place else. And And so even today, the idea that the temples on the tops of the mountains affects the way modern Israelis talk about emigrating to Israel. They call it making aliyah, or making ascent. You're ascending to the land of Israel, because the temple up in Jerusalem is the land of Israel proper. And for the Book of Mormon to do that, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Well, if you drive the road, it's probably not the road that the Good Samaritan, or that the man who fell among thieves took, but parallel to it, you are really dropping down. And when you come back up, the buses and the trucks are all in low gear, struggling up that slope. But for someone who's never been there, you're going to get the details wrong. There's a famous Latter-day Saint hymn. It's our only major contribution to anything like Christmas carols, Far, Far Away on Judea's Plains, written by John McFarlane, who lived in St. George. Well, it's a good song. I like the song, but there are no plains in Judea. It's hill country, and then it drops off down to the Dead Sea. There's not a flat space there. And so clearly this is a man who had not seen Judea, imagining what it was like. But if you imagine what it's like, you're probably going to be wrong. Certainly in the 19th century, you would be. He was. But the Book of Mormon is not wrong about these things. And it does, the river Sidon is always depicted as going in the same direction and flowing in a certain way and opening at a certain point. And over again throughout the Book of Mormon, that is kept straight.
Right.
Which to me doesn't prove the Book of Mormon true, but it makes the bar higher for a simple fraud to meet.
Right. Yes. No, I totally agree with you there. Would you like to touch on Hebraisms, Chiasmus, maybe briefly explain that to our listeners, and if not evidence of authenticity, certainly supporting the complexity of dictating this? I'll maybe ask a follow-up question that critics might push back on, that being for like a proof or strong evidence for the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, but talk briefly about that.
Jack Welch was the one who identified chiasmus in the Book of Mormon first. He heard a lecture while he was on his mission in Germany by a New Testament scholar who talked about chiasmus as a feature of authentically Semitic literature. And the chiasmus comes from the Greek letter chi, or chi, chi, which it looks something like a Roman X. And the idea is that you list things in a certain order, and then you list them again in reverse order. So A, B, C, C, B, A. And sometimes if you want to really emphasize something, you put it standing alone in the middle. So A, B, C, D, C, B, A. And a person who's acquainted with chiastic literary structures is going to get that and recognize that D is the really important part. Now, a short chiasm is easy to produce, but a longer one is more difficult. And you have, I think, one of the all-time great chiasms in Alma 36, where Alma recounts his conversion story. When he first tells it in the previous book, it's just occurred to him. It's just happened, and he doesn't have any particular order, but he's become an accomplished preacher since then. And he's put the story into what would have been for him a person from the Nephite elite, associating with the royal princes and, son of the high priest. He's been well educated. He puts it into form that would make sense to him in a good literary structure. And so if you read Alma 36, and it's available online, where Jack Welch and others have identified the different elements in it, it's not just ABC, it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, all the way through.
And then it's a beautiful piece of religious literature, and chiasmus is in there. It's impressive if you believe Joseph Smith dictated it himself. Like, it's almost like a bit of a masterpiece.
And right in the middle is Alma's calling upon Jesus Christ, which is the point of his retelling. And that is, I find it very difficult to imagine that Joseph knew he was doing that, and that if he didn't know he was doing it, that he just somehow did it by chance. Do I think Alma could have consciously formulated his story that way? Yeah, absolutely. I think he would have, given his cultural background. After telling the story formlessly at first, he then works it into a good literary form, as befits a person of his educational class.
And so this is like a literary element that sort of like ancient Hebrew writers would have used in their writings, and particularly religious writings.
Yep. And not just ancient Hebrews. I mean, there are, in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, for example, there are poems that are arranged chiastically. And they would talk about them as if they use the terminology of building a necklace. And you have all the stones or the jewels of the necklace coming down until the one thing in the middle is the pendant that the necklace holds up, and that's the important part. And they would organize their poems in that way, so each one begins with the same word in one order, and then the same word in reverse order, with one in the middle that's the poet's point. So it's
Right.
an ancient Semitic literary strategy. But Arabian poetry, pre-Islamic Arabian poetry, was their great art form. I mean, they were proud of this. It was not something you just spewed out spontaneously. It took a long time to compose that kind of thing very cleverly.
Yeah.
And so to find that in the Book of Mormon, and not just in Alma 36, but other places, if you look up articles by Jack Welch on it, John W. Welch, gives a lot of good examples, and others have identified others. I would even argue that the whole book of First Nephi is itself a chiasm, which may be one reason why it ends in a really peculiar place. It ends in the middle of a meeting, basically. Well, that's because the chiasm is over. The author of First Nephi has made his point, and then the rest is not organized in the same way, at least not in a way that anyone's discovered yet. They can be there hiding in plain sight, though, until you finally realize, oh my word, there's wordplay going on here. There's some structure here that I hadn't seen before. So yeah, I think chiasm or chiasmus is very, very impressive. There are other things. There are Hebraisms. There are
Is that like, for an example, like when Lehi said, "I have dreamed a dream," as opposed to "I had a dream," or rod of iron versus iron rod?
Yes. So I've dreamed a dream. You use what's called in Arabic a cognate accusative, where you use a noun as the object of a verb that is related to the verb. So I have dreamed a dream, or in other words, and I would say in the original, it was probably I have seen a seeing, because that's all vision means. English allows us to vary the word, but I have dreamed a dream, or in other words, I have seen a seeing. That's exactly how an ancient Arab would have said it. Modern Arabs don't do that so much, but classical Arabic, which is in some ways a very conservative language related to the language of the Hebrews in the desert, I think would have put it exactly that way. And there are others that have been identified by Royal Skousen and others that where it seems that you're dealing with what they would call in New Testament studies a Hebrew Vorlage, an underlying text that where it still shows up in the translation. It won't always show up in translation. Sometimes it just doesn't work in translation. There is a oh boy, and I should have looked these up. I've just been really busy. But there's a passage in Helaman where the chiasm turns on an equation of the Lord and the name Zedekiah. Well, it doesn't really work in English. But if you realize that Sidkiyahu, the name for Zedekiah, involves the name of Yahweh, Sidkiyahu, which they would not have said. They would have said the Lord. Then the pun works, or the wordplay works perfectly in a hypothetical original language, although it's destroyed. The rest of the chiasm is clear in English, but right at that point, it's kind of damaged by the English, because we don't naturally see an equation between Zedekiah and the Lord. I mean, if anything, quite the opposite. Zedekiah was not even a good king. A pun in an original Hebrew, which to me is a clue to the original language of the text, where you find something that you don't expect, or you expect a pun there and it doesn't show up, and then you realize, it could have been there in Hebrew.
Right. And what would you say to, some critics would say, Joseph Smith, he had the King James Bible, and there would be maybe chiasmus or Hebraisms in there. In the late war, I think there was some chiasmus in there, and they would say that, people in that time in, 19th century frontier America were just able to speak in chiasms, and if you knew the Bible really well, that could account for it. Do you have a quick response to that?
Yeah, my quick response would be, okay, I'm not sure that I'm convinced even in the level of short chiasms, but I could maybe grant that short chiasms might be something. It just sounds fun, I went out the door and saw the car. After seeing the car, I came back in the door. That's easy to do. I could do that all day long with short chiasms. But doing long ones like Alma 36, where no one even noticed it until Jack Welch did in the 1970s, that seems to me not the kind of thing you pick up somehow by osmosis by reading the King James Bible. You wouldn't notice it. Nobody had. People were beginning to talk about chiasmus, but they were scholars in Europe, not exactly available and not exactly mainstream, but certainly not available to Joe Smith, the farmer's son, living out in frontier New York. And then for him to create chiasms like that, again, dictating at about the rate of 8.5 to 11 pages a day, that means that Alma 36 took an hour or so, an hour or two maybe, to dictate. And there's no evidence that Joseph ever noticed it. Nobody ever talked about it. No, if I had come up with something that clever, I would have at some point said, by the way, did you notice this subtle literary form in Alma 36? Joseph never did, because he probably didn't know it was there.
Yeah, didn't realize. I know as well, something that I've looked into and seen is like, this is really interesting, adding to complexity and orally dictating, is in the first chapter of Ether, where it lists like the 30 kings, and then in like reverse order talks about them, and that's again quite an amazing thing. If he was having to do it off memory, you might speculate, well, maybe he had a peek at the manuscript, critics might think, but it seems like he was just having to remember that, or he was just translating. But that's quite impressive, the list of the 30 kings and then dictating it in reverse order.
Yeah, I think so. Some people have said, well, he had a prodigious memory. Well, more than anyone I've ever met, if that's the way you want to go. I've never seen anybody who could do that kind of thing, and day in, day out, just every day come in and dictate, as I say, 8.5 to 11 pages of manuscript, having memorized it or something. And I want to say something too about having a text. The witnesses all indicate that he didn't have a text with him. He wasn't consulting from a manuscript or anything like that.
Yeah.
But there's good reason to believe that he was not, for another reason. People have mocked the idea that he translated while looking into a hat. Now, I think it actually makes sense if he's dealing with an object where it apparently has glowing writing on it. The room has got to be light enough for Oliver Cowdery or whoever it is to be taking dictation. You can't write in pitch black. I know when I've tried to write notes from a movie, I read them afterwards. Well, actually, sometimes I just can't because, the writing is all over the page and it doesn't make any sense. It had to be light enough for Oliver or whoever to be taking dictation. But if there's an even slightly dimly glowing object in the room, you've got to find some way to exclude that ambient light. And so it makes sense to me to have the seer stone, the Urim and Thummim, whatever, at the bottom of a hat or enclosed in some way so that you can exclude that light. But what that means is if you're excluding the light, you cannot be reading from a manuscript. If your head is in a hat and you've got a manuscript there, you can't read it. So it seems to me the evidence for his not having had a manuscript is pretty strong, just in terms of reason and in terms of eyewitness testimony. He didn't have anything that he was working from. So you really have to say that he was working from memory, or he was genuinely reading from something that seems to have glowed a little bit, something like that. And I lean toward that for several reasons. We have several accounts indicating Joseph was surprised by what he saw. So, for example, the famous story of him pausing at one point and asking Emma, who was serving as a scribe, so Emma, did Jerusalem have walls around it? And she says, yes, I think it did. Oh, good. I thought maybe I was being deceived. Well, that means he didn't know the walls were coming. He was surprised by the mention of walls around Jerusalem. And there are other passages. For example, at the end of First Nephi, and it's Royal Skousen who noticed this in the manuscript. What Oliver would do then would simply be to write chapter for the next chapter, and he does it again, and then it's crossed out because now they've discovered it's a new book, Second Nephi. Joseph didn't know that in advance, which is suggestive to me that he didn't have a manuscript that he was familiar with. he's discovering things as he goes along.
Right, gotcha. Okay, well, let's move on and we can talk a wee bit about if there's not anything you want to talk about in terms of like the text. There's probably so many things that we could talk about, but why don't we transition towards like geography and any archaeological evidence to support the Book of Mormon's historicity. Maybe you could talk about, old world geography and, parallels to the text of the Book of Mormon, such as, Nahom, bountiful, Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert. If you could talk about that.
Well, that part of the Book of Mormon is of special interest to me. I've always wanted, but have never had time to give it a really serious look myself as an Arabist. Fortunately, some other people have done it and have done some very good work. The fact is that First Nephi seems to describe the Lehite party as traveling down along the coast of the Red Sea in what is today Saudi Arabia, and then turning due east at a place called Nahom, and arriving at a place that they call Bountiful on what seems to be the Arabian Sea coast. And the funny thing is that we've now discovered things that make that seem very, very plausible. We do know that there was a place that bears the name Nehem or something like that. There's a tribal confederation called Nehem, N-E-H-E-M or N-E-H-H-E-M. And if you know anything about Semitic languages, you know that the vowels can vary. It's the consonants that matter. So NHM is the fundamental thing there. Almost always 3 consonants. And they're right in exactly the place where it ought to be is the heartland of the Nehem Tribal Confederacy. Now, at first, we found evidence that that tribal name went back there to 900 AD, which I thought was probably about as far back as we could go. That part of Arabia being a place that's relatively free of inscriptions and civilizations, and you don't have a lot of history there. But 900 AD was still 1,500 years removed from Lehi, but it was instructive that it was in the right place and so on. And then an altarpiece was discovered that bore the name of Biathar the Nehemite, and it dates from, according to the German archaeologists who found it, about 600 BC. Which means that it was there at the time that Lehi and his party came through. And it's really striking to me that Lehi gives names to places. Like he gave the name Laman to a place. He gave the name Lemuel to a place. When he comes to Nahom, the name of the place was called Nahom.
Yes.
Suggesting he didn't give it. It was already there. And we now know that it's in the right place and it's there at the right time. And it appears to have survived down to this day. In the name of
that's
that
where
tribe.
Ishmael was buried, was at the place called Nahom, and my understanding it's sort of like a burial site as well.
Yes, and there is a burial site there, and Neil Rapley has done some interesting work recently indicating there is a burial of a man named Ismail or Ishmael there. Now, is this really our Ishmael? I don't know, and I don't even if you exhumed the bones, if there are any left, I don't know how you'd prove it was the Ishmael.
How can we tell?
But it's amazing to me that there is an Ishmael buried in the place where Ishmael is buried in the Book of Mormon that bears the same name, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to me, well, I mean, you can explain it away, just pure coincidence. But at a certain point, I think the idea of coincidences becomes a little bit of a stretch. And the fact is that Joseph shouldn't have known anything about the microgeography of Arabia. I guarantee if you pick the average Irishman off the street, or the average American, and ask him, okay, give me a description of the interior geography of ancient Arabia, especially. But even modern,
no clue.
No clue. They don't know anything about it. And Joseph,
people were to postulate, what about the possibility that maybe he had a map of Arabia and somehow had access to that? And I think most critics would just say, oh, it's just NHM on an altar. It's just a coincidence, just happens to be sort of in the right location, and it's sort of like a lucky hit. What would be your response to that?
Well, I'd say, it could be that. I mean, you can dismiss a lot as lucky hits. It's not a proof, but it's awfully strong to me. And at a certain point, almost anything can be a coincidence. You can say, well, I predict in advance that a meteorite is going to fall out of the sky and kill Bob Jones living in Wichita, Kansas. And the next day, a meteorite falls out of the sky and kills Bob Jones in Wichita, Kansas. You could say pure coincidence. You can say that. I'll tell you a story from my mission. Unfortunately, even at my advanced age, there are still good stories that I think of from my mission.
Oh, yeah.
Tracked it out a family in Switzerland where the lady heard where we were from, and she got a very odd smile on her face and said, "Just a moment, let me get my husband." She went and got him, and she said, "Guess who they're from?" And said the name of the church, and he got a funny smile. And I thought, okay, are we dealing with crazy people here? And what's going on? Well, it turned out he had been a member of the church. And the only thing I know about his story is from him. I haven't been able to verify it, but he told me the story that he had grown up in, I guess, what is today, well, it was the former Yugoslavia. I don't know exactly where it was. And he was a counselor, I think, to a district presidency there. And when the communists took over, he said the district president would have dreams, happened several times, where he would realize in a dream that the secret police were going to come for brother so-and-so. And he would warn brother so-and-so to get out of the country, flee to Italy or go someplace.
Wow.
And this fellow said, and that happened 4 or 5 times, I think. And but he said, then I came to Switzerland to study medicine, and I realized it's all just brain chemicals and chance. And I said, well, I don't know anything about the story other than what you've told me, but that seems a stretch. And he said, yeah, I learned that there is no God, and that it's the brain is just a chemical factory and that sort of thing, chemical processor. It's just coincidence. I said, but you yourself said he was never wrong, that 4 or 5 times he warned people to get out of Yugoslavia, and they did, and the secret police knocked on their door within a day or two. Yeah, he said, coincidence. Well, okay, it could be.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, I think to myself, I'm having a hard time buying it.
I know for me, because I've gone through a faith journey. I went through a faith crisis, and I left church for a while, and had a lot of the issues a lot of people tend to have. And whenever I was sort of exploring apologetics, and whenever I looked at Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, and really looked at how a lot of the locations were matching, like Shazer and like the Red Sea, and then going through the frankincense trail, and then Nahom, but then how they traveled like nearly eastward, I think it was, and then there was a location that seemed to correlate with Bountiful. And to me, it seemed like there was things that converging together to at least, if not prove, support that this, I think, could have been a historical travel of Lehi and Nephi. And obviously people can interpret it different ways, but to me, I thought this is plausible evidence.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'd say, look, I don't think it proves, but it certainly is consistent, and more than consistent, with the claims of the Book of Mormon. Now, let me just pause and say, I don't think that the Lord is in the business of proving. I don't think that's the way it's supposed to be. If there were intellectually coercive demonstrations available, then any person who understood the argument would have no choice but to join the church and give his or her life to service in the kingdom, right? I mean, there is no room for faith in geometrical proofs. If you understand the proof and it's a valid proof, then the conclusion follows. That's it, period. I don't think it's intended to be that way in religious matters. We're intended to walk by faith. Now, again, people will sometimes ask me, well, does that mean that if I just get the proposition wrong that I'm going to hell? I don't think it's that. I think that it's a test of what you want. What kind of life do you want to lead?
Almost like intentional ambiguity or evidence and reason on both sides.
Yeah, I think that there's sufficient reason to justify a life of faith. I don't think there's enough to coerce it, to compel it. And I think that's exactly where it's supposed to be. And so I would say with the Book of Mormon, sometimes people will ask me, what is the single best proof of the Book of Mormon? Well, I don't tend to talk about proofs of the Book of Mormon anyway.
Yeah.
Even the question, what is the single best evidence? I'm not sure I even like that formulation. I think it's a cumulative case. It's a whole host of things that come together to make it, to my mind, more probable than not, just speaking purely intellectually, that the Book of Mormon is what it means.
I think Brian Gardner would agree with you as well. As I've listened to him, and we had an interview and reading his book, and he liked to focus more on like how well does it sort of converge and align with history rather than looking for the single bit of proof.
Right. I mean, I suppose the Lord could put something somewhere in Mesoamerica, for example, that says Nephi was here, Even that, I'm convinced. I saw an interview with Sandra Tanner, who's sort of a professional anti-Mormon in Salt Lake, and she was asked once, "What if they found that?" She said, "Well, we'd have to think about it." And I think that's, I think that's right.
I asked Dan Vogel a similar question if they found Zarahemla, and he said it would open. He would consider, the Book of Mormon's historicity. It was a hypothetical one, as well as we had a discussion about the witnesses. So we've talked about old world geography and the parallels, but then do you want to talk about, is there evidence for New World geography? There's John Sorensen's model. Is that sort of like the model that you would hold of the limited geography in like the Gulf of Mexico and northern Guatemala? And would you like to talk about any evidence you see there? I think it would be with LIDAR technology, evidence to support the Book of Mormon there.
Yeah, I lean toward the Sorensen model. I'm sure it can be modified and will be modified as the years go by, but that's the one that I found most persuasive. I find that there are a large number of people in the United States, at least, who subscribe to what they call a Heartlander model of Book of Mormon geography, which puts things up in the upper Midwest, Illinois and Missouri and Iowa and places like that, or up into the Great Lakes. I frankly don't much care about geographical issues. No, I find them very interesting, but I find them of secondary or tertiary importance.
Right. Yeah.
My concern is that the Book of Mormon took place, not exactly where it took place. My testimony doesn't hinge on the exact GPS coordinates of the Jaredite city of Lib. It just doesn't matter. So somebody can hold a different view than I do, and I'm fine with that. But I find the Mesoamerican view persuasive, and until I'm persuaded otherwise, that's the direction I am inclined to go.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Because one of my listeners want me to ask you about if you lean more towards the geography in Mesoamerica versus Heartland, and what might be your reasons for that, without bashing on the Heartlanders, because I know it can be quite divisive between that. But what would be your reasons for going more with the Mesoamerica model?
I think you have evidence for advanced civilizations of the right period in Mesoamerica. You have evidence of writing at the right period. I'm not sure you have that kind of evidence in the U.S. Upper Midwest. There are certain clues to me also that are very suggestive. You have the story of Tiancum going and killing Amalickiah, the evil Lamanite usurper, actually Nephite apostate, and if you are careful not to pay attention to the chapter headings, it's clear that Tiancum kills Amalickiah on New Year's Eve, which is a really inauspicious time for a king to die in ancient mentalities. It's a very bad omen when your king dies on New Year's Day. That means it's a bad year coming. But one of the things it says is that people didn't wake up when Tiancum snuck into the Lamanite camp because of the heat and the labors and the fatigue of the day. And that tells me one of two things, and maybe both, that if it's hot on New Year's Eve and New Year's morning, this is not our calendar in upstate New York, because upstate New York around Rochester, Buffalo, Palmyra is really cold at that time of the year. This is hot. It's so hot that they're fatigued by the heat. So it tells me it's either a different calendar or that it's not upstate New York. And there's no reference in the Book of Mormon, except in quotations from Isaiah, to things like snow. It never seems to happen. But there are areas where they have lots of snakes, which I can well imagine in the jungles of Mesoamerica. I was out once in jungle Guatemala going around with some archaeologists, and I noticed they were all wearing metal shin guards, except for us, the 2 or 3 of us that were not of their number. And they were banging on rocks with their machetes and so on. And I said, why? And they said, well, because there are really bad snakes here. They're the most poisonous snakes in the Western Hemisphere that live in this jungle. I said, oh, that's really encouraging. And you're wearing shin guards. Yeah, well, we didn't have enough for you. So I said, but you do have an antidote, right? And the expedition doctor who was along said to me, well, yeah, we do have an antidote, but given the effects of the antidote, you'd probably rather die. Right. And I thought, I was enjoying this until just a minute or two ago, and now I'm kind of eager to get out of this jungle and get somewhere where I'm not surrounded by bushes and these snakes. But those snakes are characteristic of certain areas in Central America, Mesoamerica. But up around Buffalo, New York, I don't know. I haven't looked. I don't even know if they have that many snakes because it's so cold.
Mm-hmm.
Cold-blooded animals just don't do as well up in a climate like that. So there are just a lot of things, but it just seems to me too that the rough chronology of the Olmec and the Maya and so on corresponds with the chronology of the Book of Mormon. Now, I'm not identifying the Olmec and the Jaredites or the Maya with the Nephites, but it seems to me the general outline of history there fits. The civilization erupts into prominence at around the right time in the pre-classic period, and seems to have a collapse around the right time. And just a lot
Frank
of things.
Garner, he talked about in his book about the Nephites wanting Nephi to become a king around the time where the Mayans were having kings as well, and that sort of like fits in with the historical sort of timing.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And so people ask me, well, do you believe that the Maya were the Lamanites? I'm not sure. The Lamanites may have been an element among the Maya.
Right.
Were the Lamanites even pure Lehites by the time they show up in history? I doubt it. They had no reason to live within the covenant or marry within the covenant. They would have intermarried with the local populations. And so they probably lost their identity pretty quickly. So,
right. And we'll probably talk about this a wee bit more in part 2 when we talk about DNA. But I think the assumption, or at least the belief that I grew up with, I would say most members of the church who aren't scholars would have believed, and I think even probably from Joseph Smith until Gordon B. Hinckley, that the principal ancestors of the Native Americans were the Lamanites, and that the Lamanites and Nephites, they populated the entire continent of North and South America, and with DNA, and also understand that there was other civilizations here long before they couldn't have inhabited the entire continent. And it doesn't fit with the distances in the Book of Mormon. It had to be a smaller land mass that they were living on. That was sort of like the general sort of assumption that I think most members had.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when we looked at maps, you see a land northward, land southward, and a narrow neck of land. Well, that's obviously North America, South America, and the Isthmus of Panama or something like that.
Yeah, Mexico and Panama.
Yeah, it fits perfectly. But I think one of the contributions, I'm not sure it was original with John Sorensen, but it's crucial, is to sit down and actually calculate the distances that people traveled in the Book of Mormon. And they're never more than a few days in any direction. That is, the area simply cannot be from the Aleutian Islands to Tierra del Fuego in the south. It cannot be. It's an area of a few hundred miles in any direction. That's the functional land of the Nephites anyway, whatever the Lamanites did. We don't know much about the Lamanites apart from when they collide with the Nephites. What they're doing out in their lands, we don't know. But the
Nephites, genealogy of the Nephites.
Yeah, it's a lineage history, as John Sorensen used to put it, of the Nephites. And they're not interested in the other people. You get a complete lineage of, well, for example, the Jaredite kings. It's also a lineage history in a way. So that sometimes you have kings, quote unquote, who serve their entire kingship in captivity. Meanwhile, the actual reigning king, we're not told his name. It's not interested. One of the striking examples to me is Samuel the Lamanite. We don't know anything about him before he shows up on a Nephite wall. And when he jumps off a Nephite wall, that's the last we hear of him, because he's not part of the Nephites' general scene, their framework. He must have been, I assume, a great prophet before he showed up on that Nephite wall. And presumably he didn't stop when he jumped off it, unless the wall was as high as Arnold Freeberg's wall, in which case he died when he jumped off it. But I doubt that the walls looked anything like Freeberg's illustrations. But he's only of interest to the Nephites so long as he's talking to Nephites. You can't construct a history of the Americas from the Book of Mormon. It's not even interested in the history of the Lamanites and who they're intermarrying with, what they're doing, unless and until they collide with the Nephites, and then it becomes an issue.
Right. Okay. So, I think we'll talk about this more when it comes to the DNA, but you're sort of bringing it up because critics would say like, oh, it was only the Nephites and the Lamanites, if you read maybe the Book of Mormon at face value, and they point to maybe some scriptures that talk about like they're brought to, like the promised land, kept from knowledge of other nations, and like the Jaredites, went to a land where never man dwelt. And at face value, you might think, oh, they populated the entire continent and they weren't really intermingling with these other populations. I know it talks about the Mulekites, and I think it's Mosiah or whatever book that's in the Jaredites before. But some scholars, and I know Brant Gardner, said to me, there's implicit references that there had to be other people here, and we know from science as well. But you're saying that they would have been more focused on their own sort of what was the word used to describe their
it's a lineage history. A
lineage history. That's it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you tell the story of your family, your ethnic group, and the other ethnic groups are only important to the extent that they interact with you. Mm-hmm. It's very egocentric in a way, very ethnocentric.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
People were,
self-absorbed.
Yeah, they were. I mean, the the Chinese were the Middle Kingdom, and the Jews. It was the Jews, and then the Gentiles, the nations, everybody else out there. The Romans called the Mediterranean our sea. It's ours. We don't care about the other people. I mean, the Egyptians had the idea that they looked right and everybody else around them looked weird. And the Greeks, people who speak Greek are civilized. People who speak other languages, who cares what they are? They're all barbarians. I mean, the word barbarian comes from the Greeks imitating non-Greek speech. Bar. It's just nonsense. It's gibberish. And we're talking here about Persia, one of the great empires of the ancient world, but to the Greeks, just barbarians, because they didn't speak Greek. I mean, every ancient society is ethnocentric, and I would say, and this is, by the way, relevant to the Book of Mormon too. People sometimes say, well, the Nephites seem to be racist. The Book of Mormon is racist. It talks about dark-skinned people.
Lamanites.
I would be surprised if they weren't, because that was the ancient attitude. Aristotle himself, the greatest thinker of the ancient world, thought that people who were slaves, countries that were slaves, were, they were by nature destined to be slaves. That's what they're supposed to be, because they're not Greeks. They're primitive barbarians, and so it's right to enslave them. And so if you find somebody in the ancient world who thinks, everybody is equal, we're all alike, I'd like to know about him, because I'm not aware of anybody.
Right.
So even the Muslims divided the world into the Dar al-Islam, the abode of submission, and the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war. And that's everybody else out there. And the Iranians, I'll think of one other. The Iranians divided the world in two. There were the Iranians and the Turanians. Turanians are the bad guys. And they could be, at various points, the Chinese, the Turks, the Romans, everybody else outside of Iran is Turan. So,
right. And so this is sort of like the history of like civilization, always the us versus them, and this tribalism. I was going to ask this question later, but since we're on this topic, I'll ask it briefly now, because some people would be concerned about the scriptures that talk about, the Lamanites being cursed with the skin of blackness. And yeah, this seems racist. And is this God cursing people with black skin? How would you interpret those racist passages in scripture about cursed with the skin of blackness? Do you believe it's a literal cursing of skin that God was doing? Do you believe that is the Nephites, or like that's them, being racist towards the Lamanites, creating this us versus them? And some critics think that this came from, Joseph Smith's environment and the mound builder myth, that, they viewed the Indians as sort of like savage, and that they couldn't have created, Savage and Dorothy couldn't have created these civilized, mounds and things, and that he's sort of inputting that, if you believe he's the author, into the Book of Mormon narrative. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it could be several things. The Nephites probably were racist. As I say, by our standards, just about everybody in a pre-modern generation has been racist. I mean, my own parents said things. They were sweet people who would never treat anybody badly. I saw them dealing with people of Hispanic descent, Black ancestry, and so on, and always respectful. But they would occasionally say things that I thought, oh, please never say that in front of my friends. They've grown up with these attitudes. My father in North Dakota is a Lutheran, my mother in St. George, whereas she herself said she never saw a Black person until she was about 16 or 17. But, they had these attitudes that made my skin curdle, I made it crawl.
Right.
And now we don't say things like that. At least we hope we don't. But racism was not a big deal for people. They were unabashedly racist in many ancient times. On the other hand, could there have been a real change of skin color to dark? Yeah, especially, I think, if, as I believe, the Lamanites went out and began intermarrying with local indigenous tribes. Their kids would have been darker skinned, and the Nephites might have observed this and says, "Ha, it's a curse." You know, they're being
Right.
distinguished from us by skin color. But
And
it would have been
attributing that
awful.
to God cursing them to
Yeah.
distinguish.
You have the case where Captain Moroni is fighting with it's Zarahemna, and he defeats Zarahemna and calls for an end to the fighting. And he says, "You see how God has blessed us, you know, to be victorious over you." And Zarahemna says, "Nah, it's not God. You've got better weapons and better armor." And there are two ways of looking at it.
Mhm.
And I think Zarahemna is right. Yeah, the Nephites had better armor. They'd been preparing under a military genius, Moroni, for this war. And so they were better equipped. The Nephites were covered with armor. The Lamanites came to battle basically without much on. And, you know, all things being equal, you're going to lose.
Mm.
But on the other hand, Moroni is not wrong to see it as God blessing them.
Yes.
That, you know, he blessed them to prepare, if nothing else, you know. And
Mhm.
so it's just two ways of looking at the same thing. Could the
Right.
Nephites have been right that it's a kind of divine curse indicating that they've separated themselves from the covenant people? Yeah, because they're intermarrying outside the covenant. Are we right to adopt that and condemn dark-skinned people? No, it's not our world. We
Right.
shouldn't do that. And so the Book of Mormon also contains wonderful anti-racist passages. President Nelson quoted one just yesterday in his remarks. He won an award from a historically black college in Atlanta, Morehouse College, and he quoted the Book of Mormon as saying that all are alike unto God, you know, black
Mm.
and white, male and female, bond and free, all are alike unto God. That's also in the Book of Mormon. And you know, by the end of the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites are no longer a racial category. They're an ideological category. You choose to be a Lamanite. They're all
Right.
mixed up otherwise. Lineage isn't mattering anymore.
Mhm. Okay. So let's go back to New World sort of geography. Maybe could you touch on a little bit about LIDAR technology, if you're familiar with that, and if that supports or doesn't support some of the things talked about in the text of the Book of Mormon? I believe it was sort of in northern Guatemala, like these laser beams down they could see below the surface. Talk a wee bit about that.
Well, it's very exciting. I don't think we've seen yet very much from it. It's going to take a lot of time. There's a lot of work to be done with it. But one thing they discovered right off was that the cities were interconnected with, well, the Book of Mormon term is highways,
Yes.
roads that we had not seen. And now you realize the population was much larger than people had assumed. It's much more densely populated. I saw one comment early on that it seemed that the population in Central America, Mesoamerica, was more dense than that in the British Isles at a comparable period, which is really, really interesting. And there were more cities. I know from having been there and clomped along in the jungle a little bit how easy it is to get lost. You can't figure out where you are. You can't see anything. And to pass within just a few feet of a major ruin. I remember at one point passing by what I thought was a little rise or a hill in the jungle. One of the archaeologists with me said, "Do you know what that is?" And there were trees growing out of it and so on. He said, that's a temple. It's a temple pyramid. It was excavated a few decades ago, but it's overgrown again. And the growth of the jungle is so rapid that you just can't see anything. But you can walk within a few feet of a building and not see it. You know, in the Book of Mosiah, you have people getting out in the wilderness looking for the land of Nephi and getting lost, and they can't
Right.
figure out
Yeah.
where they are and so on. When I spent that time in the Guatemalan jungle, I thought, I know how this works. Oh man,
Mhm.
you could go in circles and not know it. Unless
Right.
you're one of the local guides who lives in the jungle, they knew what they were doing. We actually lost a BYU vice president. I won't name him. He wandered off by himself and got lost. And we realized he was gone. We didn't know where he was. And the local Indian guide said, "Don't go looking for him. Then we'd have to find you. You just stay right here. Don't go anywhere." And they went out and they were able to find him. He was, by the way, sitting in a panther's lair. He didn't know it, but he was taking drinks from the leaves, catching rain in leaves and drinking because he was dehydrating. Fortunately, the panther was not home. Had the panther come home, he might have had a really interesting experience.
Wow.
But he was totally lost. And he thought, well,
Yeah.
I'll just turn around and go back to where the river is. He couldn't find it. And so, to my mind, LIDAR opens up a whole new perspective that this was an urban society on a scale that we had not realized, connected with carefully built highways. And the Book of Mormon says the Nephites, it talks about throwing up highways, building them like this above the jungle floor, which you can understand. You put a stone highway out there because otherwise it's mud for much of the year. I mean, you just can't travel. It's really difficult.
I think was there like fortresses as well,
Yes.
like support, like there was warfare amongst, the Mayans.
And we didn't know that. I mean, for a while, some of the criticisms, the more sophisticated criticisms of the Book of Mormon were that it depicted a land of continual warfare. But the Maya, they said, were a peaceful people who tended their bean fields and their corn and didn't fight. We now know that was totally untrue. You read some of their books where they describe constant warfare, blood sacrifices, the whole bit. But also, I remember going to one archaeological ruin, Yaxchilan, where for a long time people said, well, how interesting. It's got no city walls, nothing, so it must have been a peaceful time. It was only when you got aerial photographs that you realized there were concentric city walls around it that had simply melted, because they were like the Book of Mormon walls, not the Arnold Freeberg walls. They weren't made out of Cyclopean stones. They were made out of palisades of mud with with trees along the top. Well, in an area of hundreds and hundreds of inches of rainfall each year, the mud eventually melts down, the trenches are filled in, and the wood disintegrates. But you can still see in aerial photography where the walls were. And it turns out this was a heavily fortified city, just like the Book of Mormon would say. But, so the early archaeological sense was no walls, therefore no warfare. The archaeologists were literally walking over the walls. They just couldn't see them.
And what would you say to, there might be critics or people who've left the church, and they might say, like, are there any, Nephite artifacts, or is there anything, from archaeology showing that this is a Nephite building or a Nephite temple, a Nephite artifact? And what about, like all the battles that were happened in the Book of Mormon? Is there any evidence of, swords or, skeletons, things like that? What would be your response to that?
Well, again, in an area of this kind of rainfall and acidic soils and so on, skeletons are not going to last very long. And I think that there are plenty of places where battles took place. Even Maya battles and so on, we'll never find much to indicate that they were there. And the swords were by and large not metal swords of the kind we imagine, though even those would have decayed probably in that kind of environment. But they were probably swords made of obsidian and wood. And so they're largely gone.
What do you think about when Nephi says he fashioned a sword after the sword of Laban?
I think he might have tried to make one according to his technology. He might have even made one that looked a lot like it. I think that Nephi and his family probably had metallurgical ability, but was that passed on? Was it even functional in their environment? Was it practical to make a hoard of metal swords? Probably not. But yeah, he might have had one that looked a lot like that, or several that looked a lot like that. I like a comment of my friend John Clark, who's a very eminent Mesoamerican archaeologist and a Latter-day Saint. He said, are there any Nephite artifacts and lamanite artifacts? He said, yes, the museums are probably full of them. We just don't know. How do you identify it as a Nephite artifact? It's a
Right.
pot from a certain period in a certain place. Was it Nephite? We don't know.
How do you determine that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pot. It doesn't say this is a Nephite pot. It's just a pot.
Right.
And so he said, yeah, I expect that the museums are full of Nephite artifacts, but unless and until we discovered some sort of technique of deciding what is and is not a Nephite artifact, we're not going to know.
Okay. Thought I'd ask you briefly about Hill Cumorah, because I think the understanding that Joseph Smith had is the plates were buried in the Hill Cumorah in New York, and I think Heartlanders might point to that. But my understanding, it's a clean hill, no artifacts have been found from the Great Battle, and that the Hill Cumorah in the Mesoamerican, geography or location for the Book of Mormon, it would have been down in, the Gulf of Mexico, northern Guatemala. And people would say, what are your thoughts on then, like a second hill Cumorah and then the plates going up to New York? Your thoughts on that? Because I know that Mormon buries the plates in, I think, the hill Cumorah, but Moroni doesn't. Maybe just talk a wee bit about that.
Yeah, the curious thing is the Book of Mormon doesn't say where Moroni's final burial of the plates was. We know where Mormon buried a whole host of plates and where he buried the Book of Mormon plates, but Moroni went and got them. And then his last several years are unchronicled. We don't know where he goes. We do know that he has about 36 years after the final battle of going where, I was going to say going where he wants to go. I don't think he really had much choice. I think he had to go north to escape the Lamanites. They were looking for him. I mean, he's the son of the Nephite commander. He's the last prominent Nephite holdout. He's got the plates, which they would like to destroy, and he heads north. And so, yeah, my feeling is it doesn't bother me at all to think that the place of the final battles was somewhere in Mesoamerica. I know the hill Cerro Vigía has been identified near Veracruz in Mexico as a likely candidate, and that certainly could be it. It's big enough. It fits all the descriptions, land of many waters and all that kind of thing. But then Moroni has 36 years, presumably under divine guidance, to take the plates where they need to be. And that's a lot of time. Now, people say, you mean you could have traveled all the way from southern Mexico to upstate New York? Well, yeah, there was a man actually in, I think, the year 1611 who did that. He was a British sailor shipwrecked on the coast of what is now Guatemala, who basically fled and made it to what is effectively New York State today. And it took him about 11 months to do it. But the landscape that he was traversing was essentially the same as the landscape that Moroni would have had to traverse. There were no modern bridges or superhighways or anything like that. And yet, so we know that of somebody who apparently did it, and Moroni had many times that length of time to get from where he was to another place. But we know nothing about his travels. He doesn't say anything about them.
Right.
Shortly after the battle, and then that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the name Cumorah, it's ambiguous, but it's not clear that the early Latter-day Saints called that hill near Manchester Cumorah, or that they identified it necessarily as the hill where the final battles were held. Now, it became traditional later on, and nobody questioned it. And so people will point to me to general authority statements, not declaring by revelation that this is the hill, but Marion G. Romney, for example, standing on the hill and surveying it, and imagining in his mind's eye the scenes that took place there. Well, to me, I don't think he's claiming revealed authority for his identification. I doubt that the question occurred to him. He just assumed that it was the place, as I did growing up.
Yes.
And then when I began reading about it, I realized I don't really have any firm basis for that. Joseph Smith doesn't seem to have said this is the place.
Yes, especially because Moroni doesn't bury the plates in the hill Cumorah. That's a misunderstanding we've had.
Yeah. So if you read it, you realize that the basis for that is flimsy at best. Now they'll say, do you really mean that the hill Cumorah in New York is not important? No, I think it's very important. I think that's where Moroni buried the plates and where he had his encounters with Joseph Smith. And to me, that's important enough. Whether the battles took place there, and the archaeology seems to suggest that they didn't, and the Book of Mormon doesn't claim that they did, that's another matter. Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the witnesses of the gold plates, and you've done a lot of work on this, but and this is probably evidence for believing members to support the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. The gold plates. You have the three witnesses who claim to see the angel, hear the voice of God, and see the plates. And you have the 8 witnesses who claimed sort of in a more natural way to hold and see and heft the plates. Could you talk about your view on sort of like the testimony of the witnesses and their testimonies as supporting the authenticity of the Book of Mormon? And then I'll maybe interject with some things that critics might bring up, undermining maybe the credibility of the witnesses.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'll put in a little commercial if you don't mind. We did a couple of films on on the witnesses, and I don't know if they're available in the UK or in Ireland.
I've not seen it. I've seen a trailer for it, and I've seen
Yeah.
you promote it in some of your Far or some of your addresses. I think probably at a Far Mormon conference and other places.
Well, I would actually like to hear from you, off video at some point, if there's something we could do to get the films available over there in ways they haven't been, because I think that people will like them. I think they will. I mean, I have to say, when I saw the first rough cut of the film, I remember thinking, wow, we've put a lot of effort into this. And I've seen a lot of the individual scenes filmed, and I've, read and critiqued the script and helped choose the actors. But what if I hate it? What if it's terrible? And when I saw the rough cut, I thought, this is actually not bad. This is pretty good.
Not too cheesy.
Yeah, I'm not going to be embarrassed by it, because a lot of LDS filmmaking, frankly, has been pretty cheesy.
Yeah.
And I haven't liked it. This isn't that.
Better than The Work and the Glory.
Yeah, oh yeah. And there's some that are far worse than that. Oh, just terrible. So, we did 2 feature films, Witnesses, and then one called Undaunted, Witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Witnesses is a dramatic film, and Undaunted, Witnesses of the Book of Mormon, is a docudrama that extends the coverage from the 3 to the 8 witnesses and the unofficial witnesses, and involves talking heads. We've got scholars on screen talking about various things. And then we've done some things that are available on the Interpeter Foundation website, that we call Insights. And they're just short features, completely free, usually 5 to maybe 11 minutes in length, dealing with specific issues.
Right.
Did Oliver Cowdery deny his testimony? Was Martin Harris an unstable lunatic? That kind of thing. And we got at least 2 or 3 more coming, I think, on with Royal Skousen being interviewed, and with Dave Baird, who actually makes plates. He's made the plates for church visitors centers. He made the plates that we used in the Book of Mormon film. In the Witnesses film. And he talks about what it takes to make plates. He says a lot of people just toss out that, Joseph maybe made some plates to fake out the yokels. He said, well, I'm a professional metal worker and metallurgist, and it was hard for me. He said, you don't just toss them out. They're very difficult to make. So that's an interesting interview that's yet to come on those short features that are up on the Interpeter Foundation website, just free on demand. I encourage people to look at. So I'm very interested in the witnesses. And the thing that got me going was reading Richard Lloyd Anderson's book, Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses, which I think is one of the great works.
I need to read that book. I've listened to him at Far Mormon conferences and read through his articles, but I need to get that book.
It's a wonderful book. I was sitting in the back of a Sunday school lesson once that was exceedingly boring. And so I had my briefcase open, was rereading his book. And a friend of mine who taught at BYU came over. He was on the High Council, sat down next to me. What are you reading? And I showed him, and he said, I think next to the scriptures themselves, that's the most faith-promoting book I've ever read. And I would maybe tend to agree with him. Anyway, I think the witnesses are very, very strong. And they're strong in the sense that you have people who in many cases were offended by Joseph Smith, who later came to disagree with him, but never rejected their testimony, even when there was great incentive for them to do so, either negative incentive like threats, or positive incentives. They could have been rich. They could have been famous, by revealing the sordid truth about Joe Smith and his gold plates, but they didn't do it. David Whitmer being a signal example. I've heard explanations for him, for his faithfulness to his testimony. He lived to be the latest of the witnesses to die. Died in 1888.
He gave the most statements on it, didn't he?
Sorry?
He gave the most statements, like primary.
Oh yeah, he did. He was the most interviewed witness by quite a ways. And I remember one person writing to me and saying, well, David Whitmer remained faithful to his witness. He couldn't deny it because he was scared of Brigham Young. And I said, really? Yeah. He said, Brigham would have had him done in, if he had ever told the truth. And I said, well, there's some problems with that. Brigham Young dies in 1877. David Whitmer dies in 1888. He's got 11 years. And yet he reiterated his testimony multiple times during that period, including, this is
on his gravestone as well?
On his gravestone, yep.
Oh.
On his gravestone, it says, the record of the Jews and the record of the Nephites are one. Truth is eternal. And it has a little sculpture of 2 books, obviously the Book of Mormon and the Bible, on this pillar at his grave. he wanted to bear testimony after his death, and he was really angry at Brigham Young. He was really angry at Joseph Smith, but it didn't change what he'd seen and what he knew. And so, to me, the witnesses are really, really powerful, and they're sane, reputable, honest men. David Whitmer was honest to the point of being stubborn. I mean, I think he would have described him as crotchety. He would not back down. He would not compromise, which eventually leads to his parting with the church when he disagrees. He's a hard-headed guy.
Yeah.
Which is both a negative and a positive. It's a great thing in a witness who will not back down, no matter what, even threatened with death, which he was on at least one major occasion. And he just said, well, shoot and be damned, and bears his testimony of the Book of Mormon. So, but they're also important in different ways. I like the fact that there are different sets of witnesses. I used to wonder, well, why the additional 8? Isn't that kind of gilding the lily? I mean, just got 8 more. Okay, big deal. No, but they're fundamentally different. The 3 witnesses have a supernatural testimony. You could say, well, they're hallucinating or something. You can't say that about the 8. It's very matter of fact. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they see and half hold the plates, turn the pages, and so on and so forth. There's nothing supernatural about it. Very different experience. And you can try to explain the one away, but the explanations for that one don't work for the other set of experiences.
Right. Yeah, because you could say with the 3 witnesses, oh, they could have hallucinated or imagined seeing the angel, or with the 8 witnesses, maybe they were tricked with fake plates. But both of them combined strengthens the case.
It does. And also I'd respond to the hallucination thing. There's no evidence that they were hallucinating. And the thing with hallucinations is, you get a bunch of people in a room and introduce some sort of gas that causes them to hallucinate. They will probably all hallucinate, but they won't hallucinate the same thing. They'll have different hallucinations based on their background, their personalities, their experiences. But the 3 witnesses all see the same thing and report the same thing. And that is striking to me. And then,
whenever I talked to Dan Vogel, he would probably have pushed back and said, well, we don't know exactly if they saw the exact same angel or the exact same plates. But yes, I know what you mean. They all claim to see the angel. I know in the official history, Martin Harris separated from the other 2 because he left. And then, so it was Joseph with Oliver and David Whitmer at first, and then Joseph went and prayed with Martin Harris. But they all claimed to have a visionary experience.
Yeah. Well, and Joseph recognized the fact that you can't for sure say what another person is seeing. Heck, I can't even know. I look out the window and I see green grass outside my window, and I know what I'm seeing, but I don't know what green looks like to the next person over. Maybe it looks different than green looks to me. I have no idea. I can't get inside the person's head. I can just go by what he's said. But Joseph did say about his experience with Martin that Martin's eyes were open, and he said he saw the same things that I did. At least, I've forgotten his exact wording. He says, at least I assume he did.
Right. Yeah. You can't know for sure.
Right. I mean, I don't know.
He believes.
But he describes it, and he goes out of his way for the rest of his life. Martin is famous for, you can always identify a Martin Harris statement. Someone will ask him, did you really see the plates? And he'll say, do you see the sun shining out there? Well, if you do, as clearly as the sun is shining, I saw the plates. Do you see that tree over there? As clearly as you see that tree, I saw the plates. He likes to do that kind of comparison. It's kind of a signature for him.
And what do you think of those quotes from Martin Harris? I could think of the Stephen Burnett one, but critics would point to ones where he talks about seeing it with spiritual eyes, or I saw the plates as I see a city through a mountain, almost. And critics might jump in those quotes saying that, oh, maybe they it's spiritualized, so they imagined it. Maybe it was hallucination. Maybe it was this second sight, and it wasn't a real vision/visitation.
Well, then, for one thing, I would bring in the 8 witnesses who don't claim anything like that. They say, well, I hefted them, I turned the pages, they weighed about so many pounds, and so on. But I would also say that those statements are almost always third hand or so, and they're outliers. Because again, Martin always says, as clearly as you see that, I saw the plates,
Right.
And it was real as anything. And David Whitmer goes out of his way to say that they were as real as anything on this table,
Yeah, I think I remember a quote from him where he says, like, oh, of course we were in the spirit when we saw the angel. Like, you can't see an angel without being in the spirit, but we were in the body as well, and it was as natural as everything else was around us.
Yeah, I like Hiram Smith, who goes out of his way, I think, to almost be addressing people like Dan Vogel. He says at one point, he's bearing his testimony, he says, "I saw with these eyes, I heard with these ears, and I handled with these hands." You know, I don't know what else he can say. That's about as clear as you can state it. But then I would add in the unofficial witnesses, and there are several of them, maybe
Mary
6 or
Whitmer, she claims to see the angel and the plates in a visionary way.
Yeah, so Mary Whitmer has that experience, and Josiah Stoll sees the plates when they are uncovered by chance. Lucy Mack Smith, for example, sees the plates, or not the plates, but she sees the Urim and Thummim. She sees it glistening through a thin cloth and feels it. There are other people who have experiences much like the experiences of the 3 and the 8, many of them women. And I think partly because women were just not acceptable witnesses in courts. I don't know what it was like in the UK in that period or in Ireland, but women's testimony was not accepted in most courts of law in the US. They weren't allowed to serve on juries until into the 20th century. There's a famous play even from the 1950s, I think, about a jury and a division on a jury in a murder trial, I think. And it's called 12 Angry Men. And I've asked people, think about that title. Think about the title of the play. It's about a jury, and it's called 12 Angry Men. Now, in even the 1950s, that didn't strike people as unusual. So, a jury would be all male. We would never allow that now.
Right. Yeah.
But in those days, I think a woman's testimony wouldn't have been acceptable. And so I think that's one reason why they're not included in the 3 and the 8. But they're out there with their own testimonies, and they're very, very strong. And I think
Mormon.
I was
going to say the Book of Mormon, I believe, prophesies about witnesses as well. I think in the Book of Ether, and I think somewhere in 2nd Nephi might be 27, and then in the Doctrine and Covenants that there will be witnesses who will, see the plates as well. Which that's quite a bold, risky thing to do if Joseph Smith is making this up, and they all happen to have this hallucinatory, visionary experience.
Again, I would say, why put that challenge on yourself? Why write a lengthy book like the Book of Mormon when you could just start claiming revelations and dictate them, and nothing to see, nothing to hear? Just this thought came to me, and I'm writing it out as a revelation. You write the Book of Mormon, if you write it, and it's this long, complex book, and then you claim you're going to show material artifacts related to that book to people. And then you've got to deliver on that promise.
I think a critic might think that's a way to almost like that's what he's selling, or that's what gives him the charisma, or to convince people. If he's just claiming revelations, they might not believe. They'll be like, what? Like, we don't believe you. But if he's claiming, ancient plates, and these are the words of ancient prophets, they might think perhaps that's why. So what are your thoughts on Stephen Burnett? So I believe it's when Martin is talking to the Heartland dissenters, and they're discussing whether or not to hold on to the Book of Mormon. Stephen Burnett writes that Martin apparently said that none of the 3 witnesses, saw the plates, only through vision or imagination or spiritual eyes, and neither did the 8, sort of indicating that, they saw them, but covered in a cloth. And Dan Vogel also pointed out to me that there was a quote from, I think, John Whitmer, where he talks about like seeing the plates by a supernatural power, and some critics would then reinterpret that maybe they were just perceiving the plates through the cloth, and it was more supernatural or visionary, and they didn't actually see the plates. What's your thoughts on that?
I think they're pretty clear. You've got lots of other descriptions of their experience talking about seeing the plates uncovered, turning the plates, that kind of thing. It is true that there were a couple of points where people saw the plates covered. Martin Harris did. He hefted them on his knee in a box and said they were really heavy. He knew there was too heavy.
Describe.
But later on, he has the experience of seeing the plates themselves, and he always talks about seeing them uncovered. He saw the plates; they had the appearance of gold. There are descriptions of the plates, that they were about such and such a size. They had 3 rings. They had, people have seen them. It seems to me pretty clearly. There's just a sea of descriptions like that. You privilege one account by Stephen Burnett that seems to me an outlier and probably his own misunderstanding of what Martin Harris had said. Because Martin, I think, would have said, oh, yes, God was involved in this. We didn't see the angel and hear the voice of God without the influence of God. This was all a divine gift to us. We'd been praying for it, and it came. But he's not saying we didn't see it, or it wasn't real, or it was just imaginary. And when he supposedly says to Stephen Burnett, oh, the 8 didn't see it either, the 8 go out of their way to say, yes, I did see it. I mean, the Hiram Smith quote I just cited, I saw with these eyes, I heard with these ears, I felt with these hands. It's as if he's stepping forward to refute that claim.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not true. I saw them, and so did other people. I mean, Josiah Stoll's account is about as matter of fact as can be. Joseph is handing them through a window to hide them, gives him the stole to hide, and the cloth comes off, and Stoll sees the plates glistening under the cloth. It's not studied, it's not prepared for in advance. He just sees them.
Right.
It's not a spiritual experience. It's just an amazing bit of good fortune on his part to see the plates. And he said this, by the way. I don't know how I missed it. It was not until relatively recently that I ran across that testimony of his. I was reading the transcript of, I think, the Bainbridge, New York trial, and he's under oath. And they ask him, "No, so how do you know that Joseph had the plates? Wasn't he defrauding you?" And he says, "I know that he had the plates because I saw them, and I remember my attention suddenly being alerted that he did." And he says, "Yeah, he was passing him through the window. The cloth came loose. I saw the plates underneath, and they glistened." And I thought, oh, my word, I'd never seen that before. Now, I happen to know there's maybe at least one other account out there that has never been written about. A friend of mine and I hope we're going to write something up on this at some point. He found it, and it's an interesting account by someone who never joined the church. He's actually rather famous in American history. He lived in Palmyra or nearby, and he went by the Smith family, and the Smiths mostly weren't there. Lucy Mack Smith was home, and he said, "Can I see the plates?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, could I hold them?" And she said, "Well, okay." And she gets the plates, and he holds them within a cloth, and he says they were really, really heavy. And Martin Harris's comment about that has always struck me as unintentionally funny. I don't know that he meant it for a laugh. He says he had them on his lap, and they were so heavy, he knew that they weren't rock and they weren't wood because they were way too heavy for that. They had to be either lead or gold. And this is the part I think is funny. And he said, "I knew that Joseph had not sufficient credit to buy so much lead." But we all know
they supposedly weigh between, according to most of the witnesses, between 40 to 60 pounds is the general weight. Now, some critics, I know Dan Vogel's theory would be that they were tin plates, and that when he was going up to the hill that he was fashioning a set of plates. This is obviously the naturalistic theory, tin plates, and then the story of, when Joseph fights off the people trying to get the plates and dislocates his thumb, Dan believes that was from like bending the rings and finishing the plates, and that, yes, there were a plate artifact, there were definitely plates, but that the 8 witnesses could have been duped by the set of plates, and then the 3 witnesses might have had a hallucination / vision, but it wasn't real, but they were sincere. Like, what's your thoughts on this, or like the mass hallucination, Joseph making his own set of metal plates?
Well, again, I have problems with the idea of a mass hallucination of people saying basically the same thing. And with the idea that you can take out a small group and guarantee that they will have a hallucination. You take 8 people into the woods or 3 people, say, you can't guarantee they're going to have that experience. But it seems to me Dan, what he does is he basically dismisses the actual primary source documents and then invents his just so story to cover the data. And I mean, you can do anything with history that way if you want to. Just toss out the historical documents and come up with your own story. Dan clearly doesn't want it to be true. I like Dan, but he doesn't want it to be true. And so as long as you've ruled the divine basically impossible, then almost any counter explanation you come up with is going to be more likely than the impossible divine explanation. But I just think, look, if you're open to the idea that Joseph was telling the truth, that this really was God, then why on earth would I buy this convoluted explanation that Dan gives that involves hallucinations and faked metal and a tin prop that that was supposed to deceive people who actually lived in a time in the United States where there were gold coins in circulation. They knew what gold looked like. Doesn't look like tin. But you've got to invoke a lot of these things. It's, to me, after a while, it's a little bit like trying to save the Ptolemaic view of the solar system. You've got wheels within wheels and planets going around on wheels and reversing on interior wheels. And at a certain point, it's just too complex. And I said, just chuck it. It doesn't work. Let's go with Copernicus.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It is a complex theory, and I think that's probably the theory that most critics would have to go if they reject the historical Book of Mormon. Okay, then how else did it happen?
Okay. I think of a line from Sherlock Holmes where Dr. Watson asks him what the secret of his detective work is, and he says, well, basically, you eliminate whatever is impossible, and then whatever is left, however improbable it may be, must be the truth.
Yes,
well, it all depends
like
what you eliminate as impossible. If you eliminate the idea of God being involved in real Nephite plates and so on, then yeah, you're stuck with the best counter explanation you can come up with.
Yeah, it's possible that they could be telling the truth and maybe did see the angel and the plates. That is a possible option. Well, let's talk a wee bit about the translation process. You know, you kind of alluded to it, you know, the 85 days, you know, well, you had Martin, who was described for the 116 pages, but then they got lost and they stopped for a few months. But the Book of Mormon, as we have it today, was dictated in approximately 85 days. I've heard even less days than that. And that for the most part, you know, there's some accounts that talk about the spectacles, the Urim and Thummim. I think there's an account from Emma that says that he stopped using the Urim and Thummim. For the Book of Mormon, we have it to then use the seer stone in the hat. Stephen Smoot says we need to be a little bit more careful about determining when it was the spectacles and when it was the seer stone. There's more ambiguity, but he was using two instruments. But for the most eyewitness statements, he was, you know, putting the stone in the hat, burying his face in the hat, and dictating it as the words appeared on the stone. You know, what's your view of the translation? Do you believe that it was sort of more of a tight word for word translation, that the words were appearing on the stone and Joe Smith was reading orally, sort of dictating as he was reading it? Or do you believe it was more of a loose translation, him sort of having to translate in his mind and then dictate, and the stone was more of like a focal point for him?
Yeah.
Where do you go on like the tight versus loose, sort of like the mechanics of the translation? Was he studying out in his mind and then having it burning in the bosom, and sort of like the pure flow of intelligence, revelation coming through him, or was it the stone, you know, the words appearing? And I guess obviously none of us know. We're all sort of guessing to an extent.
Right. You know, growing up, I didn't think about it, but as I matured, then I figured it was probably Joseph Smith clothing the impressions that came into his mind in the language that he knew, which was roughly King James language. I mean, that would have been scriptural language for him. He knew of no other scripture than the King James Bible. And so that's what I assumed it to be. I am less certain of that now. I tend to be a little convinced by Royal Skousen's tight translation idea that he's reading things off the stone. Now, how much his own mind interacted with what appeared on the stone, that's another question. I don't know. Could it have affected that? Possibly. I mean, is the stone simply an automatic device like my iPhone that where how I'm feeling doesn't affect what appears on the screen? Or is it different? We do know that he couldn't translate without being in the right frame of mind. He has a fight with Emma and he can't translate. Has to go out and apologize to Emma before he can start again, which, by the way, again says to me that he's not simply reading from a manuscript, because I could have a fight with my wife and still be able to read from a manuscript. But Joseph found himself unable to translate. He couldn't figure it out. Or also when the stone was switched by
Martin Harris.
He found himself unable to translate. And so there were things that could affect his ability to translate. But I tend to think that Royal Skousen may have a good argument here. For one thing, I'm very intrigued by the things that Royal Skousen and Stanford Carmack are finding about the language of the Book of Mormon. That the language of the Book of Mormon is not King James English. It is to a certain degree, but there are elements in it that are older than the King James. that date back to a generation or two or three before the King James, early modern English, they call it. And some of those are features that don't appear in the King James Bible. That is, he couldn't have derived them from his experience of the King James Bible. And that strikes me as saying that there is a translation going on apart from Joseph's mind, because he didn't have access to early modern English. Nobody, as far as we know, nobody in Joseph's dialect area spoke like that or wrote like that. We found nothing to suggest that the forms that Royal and Stan have found are found in Joseph's language environment.
Are there any examples of that? Is it the if and conditional? Is that an example of?
That's one, and that's one that's been proposed as a Hebraism, actually.
Right. Yes.
I remember seeing that example, and there's some debate about it, but it seems to really be there in the original manuscript. And this if and thing is very, very interesting. It's bad English. We don't say it. If you don't study hard, and you will fail your class. If you don't start working, and you will be fired. We just don't say that. No one says that. Says that. No one has ever said that in any era of English, as far as I know. But I remember one day when I first heard that, sitting down with the Hebrew text of Genesis, and wondering if I could find any examples of if and in Hebrew Genesis. And I think I found 16, maybe 17, I don't remember, in the book of Genesis alone. But they're never rendered that way in English, never. But in the Book of Mormon, at one point, it seems, and anybody who's done a second language and knows it pretty well has had the experience of translating from it and having it kind of seep through into his translation, that especially if you get tired, you start speaking Spanglish, or,
Right, yeah.
you just can't keep it up. These two languages are just intermingling in your mind. And I think that maybe is what happened at that point, which might indicate that Joseph was getting tired or something. Something came through that was a reflection of the underlying language. And so that may be a clue to the translation technique too. Yeah, I find, and you'd have to go to Royal and Stan's work. A lot of it's been published with Interpeter or in Royal Skousen's huge critical text of the Book of Mormon, which is not widely available anywhere, I know, but some of it is or will be online. And there are a lot of things in it that are just, they're really peculiar. They're not modern English. They seem to belong to about 1550 or something like that. So not King James English either. And that seems to me, well, people have asked me, what does that mean? My answer is, I don't know. I have no idea what it means, except that it might be a kind of divine joke. Like, when you find this, Latter-day Saints won't be able to explain it. But non-Latter-day Saints absolutely won't be able to explain it, because there's no way that Joseph Smith had access to language from 1550, not on the American frontier. The late Bill Hamlin and I used to have a movie we wanted to make. Well, a couple of movies. One was Bill and Dan's Excellent Adventure in Anti-Mormon Zombie Hell, where the arguments just keep coming. Even when you shoot them between the eyes, they just keep coming. But the other one was to write an article really called Joseph Smith, The Cambridge Years, and to say that Joseph was a much more sophisticated student of English and ancient history and so on than you would imagine. He actually spent several years studying at Cambridge or Oxford, wherever you want him to be, University College Dublin, whatever. And because some of these things that we're discovering, I just can't imagine how he did them. How do you stick 1550-ish English, weird verbal constructions or obsolete uses of words that didn't appear in 1820s rural New York dialect or anywhere else in English in that period? How do you do that?
Yeah.
And he thought, that's a divine joke in the sense that the Lord might be saying, okay, when you find this, try to explain this away.
So you think this might be part of the divine process of the translation, because those things don't seem like they would be part of his vernacular, his vocabulary, and I could do more research on it. I don't know what I fully make of it. Yeah. I've heard about it and I want to explore it a bit.
Yeah, I would just say, look, there would have been nothing wrong if you didn't find that kind of language there. We don't need it for apologetics. No one was looking for it. I remember talking with Royal, and I hear some critics say, well, Royal's just desperate to find something to prove the Book of Mormon. No, not so. He's sublimely indifferent to that sort of thing. If you knew Royal, you'd know he doesn't care.
Mhm.
But he says, look, I'm just reporting what I found. I said, well, what do you make of it? I don't have to make anything of it. I'm just telling you what's there. And if it puzzles you, then fine.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make a case with it, but it's there.
Yeah, he's
So,
just presenting the findings.
Royal began writing about this a little bit. I talked with him about it, that he was finding things in the Book of Mormon that were obsolete English, even not only by 1828, but by 1611, when the King James appeared. They were already obsolete. And I thought, now that's really peculiar. And I asked him what he made of it. And he joked at one point about John Tyndall being on some sort of celestial translation committee. And unfortunately, that's taken on a life of its own. Some critics mock him for saying that. It was a joke. But he's saying it was sort of Tyndall English, not the English of the King James translators. It's 2 generations too early. But then I got a note from Stan Carmack. Now, Royal is a fairly well-known English linguist. He's internationally known, is taught in Europe and so on and so forth. There are books written about his linguistic theories. So he's no crackpot. Then Stan Carmack wrote to me one night and said, look what I'm finding about sentence structure in the Book of Mormon. What do you make of that? And I said, I need to put him in touch with Royal Skousen, because he also was finding independently, I think, early modern English, obsolete things. Now, Stan is an interesting guy. He's a lawyer. He got a law degree at Stanford after getting a linguistics degree there. And then he went back and got a PhD in historical syntax. I don't know too many lawyers who do that kind of thing, but that's his specialty, is historical sentence structure in Romance languages and in English. And for him to be finding those things too, I just thought, okay, it's 2 witnesses. I mean, they're both really on the cutting edge of linguistics, and they're both noticing really weird aspects of the original text, which I would not have noticed. I would just thought, well, in many cases, Stan said, look, people have pointed to these as examples of bad English.
Yes.
Oh, they are in modern English, but they were published in books that were printed by Oxford and Cambridge University presses in the 1600s, the 1500s, and so on. They were considered good English, like we was.
Right.
That sounds like hick English.
Yeah.
But a professor at Oxford could write that and publish it in an Oxford University Press book in the 1550s, and it was totally acceptable. Just
right.
strange.
Yeah. So your view of the translation process, the mechanics, because the witnesses talk about him putting his face in the hat, and the spiritual light would shine. He'd be reading the words as they appear, and would align, I'm guessing, with their witness statements, if that was probably the process, whether or not it was Joseph translating and those being the words appearing on the stone, or if it was a divine translation that he was reading. You would lean towards that there are words appearing on the stone. Yeah. Do you also David Whitmer that said that they couldn't move on until it was written down correctly? Right. What's your view on that? Do you think that's how they perceived it? Because we know from the manuscript, evidence of the original manuscript, that there's errors, and that there's been some changes, some revisions in subsequent editions. Most of the time grammar, but then like Benjamin to Mosiah, or like Mary being the mother of God to the mother of the Son of God. And whenever I first learned about those changes, soon after our mission, I was really shocked, because I would have just believed this was all directly from God. How could you alter the text of the Book of Mormon, even slightly, with grammar, little changes like that? I find that really shocking. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there are human limits in terms of just ability and energy, tiredness, and so on. And I have no doubt that Oliver was getting tired at various times. These are outdoors people, farmers and so on, who are now sentenced to spending hour after hour sitting in a dark room. And Royal says that there's a certain rate of mistakes that even the best scribe will make. I've forgotten the figure. It's something like every 37 words or something, he'll make a mistake. It's just human limits of endurance. But I don't think that the Book of Mormon was inerrant. I think that Joseph waited until a sentence was complete. It was written down. I don't think it meant it was perfect. He did spell out names.
Yes.
Sometimes I think because, and this is another argument for saying that he was unfamiliar with the manuscript, I don't think he could pronounce them. They were really long, and he just would say, okay, I'm going to spell this one out.
Yeah, like Gidonai,
Yeah.
all those sorts of things, Coriantumr.
Yeah, yeah. And we do know that Oliver wrote Coriantumr out, and he ended the word with M-E-R, because there's not a word in English that ends in M-R. Just doesn't exist. And then he crosses it out with a kind of flourish, sort of like, to me, a little bit of frustration, saying, how in the world am I supposed to know that it ends in M-R? So, he was auto-correcting himself, and it turned out that was wrong. It's not supposed to be spelled that way.
And I guess as well, if Joseph is the author, then there's hundreds of these names that he's having to, make up. And I've also heard, apologists point at some of the names having maybe some Sametic sort of connections.
Yeah. For example, the name Alma seems to be a masculine personal name from about the same period in the Middle East. And some of the other names, Panki, and some of the less common ones, seem to have Egyptian cognates. Ammon was one of the most common names in ancient Egypt.
So Nephi as well, doesn't that kind of meaning like fair and good?
Yes.
It
Yeah, there's an Egyptian word nefer, which means beautiful. But apparently in late Egyptian, the final R was pronounced as a Y, so Nephi or something like that. And late Egyptian, I mean, Egypt is really old. So 600 BC, the start of the Nephite history, is toward the tail end of classical Egyptian history. So
yeah, and
that time then changed.
And isn't the place Jershon? Is that what the? Oh, I know it's in the Book of Alma, but it talks about being like a land of or place of inheritance, and doesn't Jershon mean inheritance in
That's
Hebrew?
exactly what it means. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. The root that we would pronounce, well, we pronounce it with a J, but they would pronounce it with a Y. I mean, there is no J in Hebrew. So Jerusalem is not Jerusalem, it's Yerushalayim. And so it probably was not Jershon. Originally, it was Yershon. But Yerasha is to inherit. In Arabic, it's waratha, a related word. And it means to inherit. And then the O-N ending is a place ending, a toponymic ending, they say. So it means a place where you inherit. I mean, it's perfect. It's almost too good. It's funny. But the Joseph Smith of 1827, 1828 did not know a word of Hebrew and barely much English.
And going back to Nahom, I believe Nahom is in Hebrew. Does it mean to mourn as well? And it talks about
to sigh.
Yeah, how the daughters of Ishmael did mourn when they were there. Possibly could have been a pun put in by the writer.
Yeah, we have a fellow who's been writing a lot for us by the name of Matthew Bowen, who teaches at BYU Hawaii. He did a PhD in Old Testament studies and Egyptian at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And he's been writing a whole series of articles. We've actually published a book collection of them, where he looks at a lot of names in the Book of Mormon and sees, and he's reconstructing the original text, so it's hypothetical. But he shows how there are passages in the texts about various characters, Jacob and others, that seem to be word plays on the name. That if you were reading the original, you'd think, oh, this is clever. It's lost in English, but a person who knows the language and sort of back translates it can say, okay, here's the name, and here's the word play on his name that an ancient reader would have chuckled over or seen as significant. And it's lost on us totally. Yeah.
And it's interesting those parallels to Semitic languages, and it seems that Joseph Smith wouldn't have known that. It's interesting that those parallels are there. So we'll maybe wrap up part one here, but in summary, we've discussed textual elements in the Book of Mormon. We talked a little about the Old World geography, the Convergences, talked a little about New World geography and LIDAR technology and the testimony of the witnesses in the translation process. Any summary thoughts you want to give on just your view on historicity, authenticity of the Book of Mormon?
Well, one thing I sometimes say is, to me, that the two most powerful arguments for the authenticity of the Book of Mormon are these. One, that if the book were simply a shallow fraud by a 19th century frontier con artist, a kind of country yokel, didn't know much, and so on, I would think the book would have collapsed a long time ago. Now, I'm not saying there are no arguments against it.
We'll talk about those in part 2, but yeah.
But there are even some where I think, okay, that's a serious argument, and we may or may not yet have a really good answer to it. But to my mind, the whole thing should be an obvious fraud. I mean, the fact that it's lasted and that people with superb training in ancient studies and so on still believe it to be true and believe it to be credible. I just don't think that ought to be happening. If it's really old Joe Smith, the frontier seer, con artist who made it up, as Fawn Brody said, to sort of play a prank on his parents.
Yeah, frauds are always more apparent and look worse over time.
Yeah. Most frauds eventually collapse. But the other overarching secular argument, if you will, that I would put forward for the Book of Mormon is simply this. I have tried, I think honestly, and seriously, to construct a counter-explanation for the Book of Mormon that accounts for everything. And I can't do it. I haven't been able to do it thus far. I can find something where I can explain this or that aspect. In some cases, I say coincidence or something. But overall, the counter explanations that I've heard often simply ignore vast areas of evidence, to my mind. They just dismiss them. So if you have the idea that Joseph Smith just made it up subjectively, well, you just toss out the witnesses. And I've seen people do that. The witnesses are not important. They were all named Whitmer anyway. Whitmer or Smith. Who cares? No, you can't do that. It's not that easy to dismiss. So my thought is, I have not seen a good counter explanation. I remember an encounter that my late lamented friend Bill Hamlin had with a very prominent critic of the church. And he said, all right, you believe that Joseph Smith did not have plates. I have a question for you. Did Joseph know that he didn't have plates? Or did he think that he had plates but didn't have them? And he said, the response was, I don't have to lower myself to your simplistic, dichotomies and that kind of thing. But I think actually that's a pretty good dichotomy. If he doesn't have plates, he either knows he does not, or he doesn't know he does not have plates. Well, I think one of the reasons this fellow didn't want to venture a guess is the minute he lays out his own theory, then he's subject to criticism. It's sort of like guerrilla warfare. You attack and withdraw. Don't try to occupy territory yourself, because once you do, you expose yourself to attacks. As long as you don't propound a counter explanation, you're kind of safe.
Right.
And so Latter-day Saints are exposed to criticism because we have a theory of the Book of Mormon. We believe that it is what it claims to be. But people who just point out a criticism here, a criticism there, and then withdraw, have an obligation at some point, I think, to come forward and say, all right, what is your model? How was it done?
Right. And that's one thing I actually liked about, although I wouldn't lean towards, Dan Vogel's theory of, the naturalistic explanation for the witnesses. I at least appreciate that he tried to account for their experience and give this is his theory, because I think you could see a lot of critics or ex-Mormons would just try to forget the witnesses and just say, oh, they're all, they're treasure digging visionary mindset and magical worldview. They're just not credible. So at least it's good that, trying to propose an alternate explanation, accounting for them, not just dismissing them.
Yeah. And I would say that Dan is one of the more serious critics out there. Yes. There are a lot of critics who are not very serious, to be honest. I just don't take them seriously because they haven't offered any serious theories. They will snipe and attack, but they won't offer their own explanation. Yeah. Dan has tried, and I give him credit for that. I don't agree with him completely. We disagree on just about everything. But I do take him seriously. He's one of the best ones out there.
Yeah, very good historian and critic. Okay, well, I think we're going to pause here for part one. I think this has been good to discuss sort of like offensively a case for the Book of Mormon, evidence to support it, because I think that's important as well. It can be important for people who are maybe struggling with issues, maybe with the Book of Mormon, to look at the evidence for it. Quickly, is there any sort of good books or articles or resources you would point to people to explore for maybe a case for the Book of Mormon? I know there is a book, A Case for the Book of Mormon by Taylor Callister, which would be a good start.
Right.
Any other resources?
There was one that we published years ago that was intended to sort of play this role at the Maxwell Institute, called Echoes and Evidences of the Book of Mormon. Now, to be honest, I don't understand the title. I don't know what echoes of the Book of Mormon is supposed to mean, but evidences of the Book of Mormon I get. And the idea was that it was going to be a short, concise treatment of a lot of evidence, sort of a summary statement at the period. It wasn't quite as short and concise as I wanted it to be. I had in mind something even more staccato than that, but that would serve a purpose. There are some books. There's some books that I like to recommend just for the general credibility of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. I really like Richard Anderson's book on investigating the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. I think it's a great classic. I have mentioned others. There's one called Remembering Joseph, I think, by Mark McConkie, which is very good on Joseph's character. There's one called Understanding the Book of Mormon by Grant Hardy that I like a lot. Mm-hmm. It makes a simple point, but with real effect. He doesn't draw the apologetic lessons from it that I would, because Grant is not an apologist in the way that I notoriously am. But he's a friend again, and he argues that you have three different authors, Nephi, Mormon, and Moroni. And he doesn't draw the lesson from that I would. I think he would privately. This was published with Oxford University Press, so he kind of had to, not be overtly proselytizing about it. But
right.
But I would say, look, if you have three different authors there who take very different approaches to their material, that argues to me that you've got three separate personalities, three separate minds organizing this stuff. And I think Grant, oh my word, Grant Hardy does a really good job with that. So that's a book that I recommend very, very strongly. But Echoes and Evidences, I think, would be a good place to look at. And also some things that have been published by Book of Mormon Central. They've done things, what they call note-wise, 2 volumes at least so far, which are pretty concise and readable.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much, Dan. This has been a really good first episode. We're going to take a short break and then come back for part 2. But listeners, hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have, give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph. And we'll see you back for part 2, where we're going to be diving into some of the criticisms against the Book of Mormon, anachronisms, DNA, the King James Bible. We'll talk about maybe some of the critical theories for the Book of Mormon and Dan Peterson's thoughts on those, maybe things to do with biblical scholarship. And then I've also got some questions from some of my listeners with regards to your involvement in apologetics, and just a few maybe rapid fire questions as well. So make sure you come back for part 2. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.